Right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on this cloudy Friday. But every Friday at noon, Iowa Chapter Sierra Club goes live with an environmentally focused topic, bringing in experts and advocates to share their knowledge and insights. Today, we are excited to explore our recent report, Protecting Biological Diversity in Iowa Through Connectivity. This important report highlights how connecting Iowa's remaining natural areas can help preserve biodiversity and strengthen our ecosystem. Today, we are joined by two incredible guests, David Hoffer, Professor of Biology and Environmental Science at Briarcliff University. He teaches a wide range of courses, including conservation biology, climate change biology, zoology, and environmental science, and brings a deep expertise on biodiversity and ecological systems. Our second guest is Pam Mackey-Taylor, Director and Lobbyist for Sierra Club Iowa Chapter. Pam leads the chapter's legislative and conservation work across the state, working to advance environmental policy and protect Iowa's natural resources. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, Lunch and Learn, feel free to throw them in the chat and we'll go over them at the end. And with that, I will hand it off to you, David, to get us started.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'll let you pull up the slides. What I'd like to begin today to talk about is the problems of habitat loss and habitat fragmentation to our wildlife here in Iowa and what we can do to reconnect these areas and restore the possibility for movement and at least semi-natural dispersal for both plants and animals. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. All right. Well, Iowa was a very diverse place. There, of course, were herds of bison in Iowa, particularly in northern Iowa and northwest Iowa. There was elk. I believe that the subspecies of elk that was in Iowa is now extinct. There were 6 different subspecies, at least across the contiguous 48 states. Of course, some elk have been brought back to Iowa. Wolves would be in Iowa, as well as coyotes, as well as at least 2 different species of foxes, the gray and the red. It was a very diverse place. And of course, in terms of plants, the prairie is one of the most biodiverse areas for plants in the world. So we had thousands of species of plants and animals. About 70% of Iowa was prairie. That's almost entirely tall grass prairie. When you get to western Iowa and the less hills, that's where some of the mixed grass, the shorter grass prairies from the west would come into Iowa. Roughly 20% forest, roughly 10% wetlands, somewhere around there. Some ecologists and some maybe work for the DNR would take issue with what I said because I'm not including oak savannas, and those are sometimes included. And oak savanna, it looks kind of like a transition zone between a forest and a prairie, but it has its own unique assemblage of species and therefore is usually classified as its own ecosystem. But think about that, 70% prairie. Today in Iowa, we have almost 70% corn and soybeans. Almost 70%. It's about 66% of Iowa's, or sorry, 63% of Iowa, last I saw, is covered by corn and soybeans. Row crops now dominate the state, and about 90% of Iowa overall is in some type of agriculture. About 3% of Iowa is municipalities, so like, Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, Sioux City, Waterloo, those areas. However, only about 2% of Iowa is actually preserved, at least by the state, and 1/2 of that is just road right-of-way. So basically, the ditches alongside the roads, where maybe some remnant prairie species can eke out a living. So when we put that into perspective, Iowa is the most biologically altered state in the nation, and one of the most biologically altered places probably on the face of the planet. This, of course, has wreaked havoc on our wildlife. You can see one count of our threatened and endangered species here, 128 endangered plant species with another 178 threatened, and then 94 endangered animal species with another 74 threatened. The problem that we get with threatened and endangered species is that once you have a huge loss of the population, normally what goes along with that is a huge loss of genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is one of the bases for biodiversity, and it allows species to be able to adapt to changing environmental conditions. If we lose the genetic diversity, what we can do is we can end up conserving a species that ultimately is still doomed to extinction because it doesn't have enough genetic diversity. In order to then preserve that species, we have to go in and spend a huge amount of money on one species to try to keep it alive. Of course, we've done that very famously with the California condor. Over in Africa, they're doing that with the cheetah, but we don't have enough resources to do that with all species. So the best thing to do is to prevent them from becoming threatened and endangered in the first place. How can we do that? Next slide, please. So the number one cause of the decline of any wildlife, whether it's plants or animals in Iowa, of course, is that historically we have converted so much of the habitat of Iowa from being suitable for wildlife to human uses. When we convert habitat, then you're taking away the food, the shelter, the other types of resources that all of the wild species need. You're going to get increased runoff in many ways, or even decreased runoff in certain instances. And that's going to affect water levels as well as water quality. And when we bring up water in Iowa, one of the things that we should talk about is that we have tiled so much of Iowa. We have dredged our rivers so that now the water table is about 3 to 4 feet lower than it was historically on average throughout the state, meaning that plant roots, of course, need to go down further to find their sources of water. Declines in habitat, of course, lead to decline in biodiversity. A quick kind of figure is you lose 90% of the habitat, you lose 50% of the biodiversity. That's right away. Over time after that, you lose even more biodiversity. There is something that's called an extinction debt. In an extinction debt, longer lived species, the adults can maybe eke out a living, but they're not able to reproduce very well. It takes many years, sometimes decades, think of our turtles, for instance, for the adults to eventually die. Then the question is, how many offspring did they leave behind? If they didn't leave enough offspring behind to at least replace them, you have over the long term a declining population. And eventually it's going to go extinct unless we intervene to reverse the conditions that are causing that decline. Of course, as we've experienced throughout lots of parts of Iowa, with these habitat changes, with dredging of the rivers and streams and trying to keep them in channels, with increased runoff, the decreased amount of wetland vegetation as well as forest vegetation and prairie vegetation that stabilizes the stream banks, we get increased flooding as well after rain events. The soils themselves are, of course, degraded, and a lot of them are washing down into our rivers. And so this causes a variety of problems. And then what are we left with? We're left with a landscape that has little patches of prairie, little patches of forest, little patches of wetland here and there. And in between them is a matrix of city, row crops, grazing lands, etc., that is not really as suitable for most of the wildlife to be there. So the wildlife now have to be able to get from habitat fragment to habitat fragment just to be able to find a mate, or for, say, juveniles to be able to disperse to prevent inbreeding in a population. And if the habitat patches are too far away, then they can't find a suitable habitat patch. Either they stop mating, which means whatever genes they had are not passed on to the next generation, or they actually die because they can't find enough forage, they can't find enough cover, that sort of thing, while they're trying to find another patch of habitat. So consider our state forests. We have four state forests, right? There are 66 state parks around Iowa, and only one state in the nation that I know of has less public land than Iowa does. We have four state forests listed here: Les Hill State Forest in the west, Stevens in the south, Shimmick in the southeastern Iowa, and then Yellow River State Forest up in the northeast. Compared to what used to be here, they're all small and they're fairly isolated from surrounding ecosystems. So that if you have a species that really wants forest and that can thrive in forest, well, first of all, these forests might be too small for them. And second of all, how do they find other forested areas? After all, if a population is going to grow, the juveniles want to disperse and establish their own territories. They might not be able to do that. Now, how much natural land is left? Well, you've probably heard that less than 0.1% of our native prairies are left. I've seen where our Department of Natural Resources has said that if you add in some restored prairies, we get up to about twice that amount of prairie left. That's still, 99.8% of the prairie is gone. That might be considered progress, but it doesn't seem like it's much to brag about. So we have some state parks, some prairie areas, some preserves. There are some county parks, of course, in our cities. There are some city parks. And then, of course, along our rivers and streams, some of those areas still have some woodlands along either side of them. But we have lost the vast majority of wildlife habitat in Iowa. So anyone who cares about wildlife should be concerned about that. And the other thing we're talking about here is the basis for all life, which includes human life. What grew our amazingly rich soils here in Iowa so that we want to farm Iowa? It was the prairies. Once you get rid of the prairies, you're getting rid of the soil building processes that support the rich agriculture that we have. Next slide, please. So, habitat fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation now is a problem for species, and of course, fortunately, there are things that we can do about it. So, first, again, species are cut off from critical movement between areas. So, some species actually require a different area for breeding and a different area for feeding, or they require different types of habitat at different life stages. If they can't get to and from those different types of habitat, then they're going to die at a particular life stage and not going to be able to become adults and actually leave behind offspring. You can see in the picture here, this poor little turtle has run up against a concrete barrier. That is something that wildlife face. Think about our roads. A road to wildlife can be likened to a moving wall. And there's research to show that even rather mobile species like a white-tailed deer does not really want to cross a road if there's more than one car from either direction every 30 seconds. And so if you think about that, like I live here in Sioux City, and so once I saw that figure, I was like, what road do I see in Sioux City where there's less than one car every 30 seconds? And I can't really think of many. And especially when you look at our highways are very difficult to have that few vehicles on them. So eventually they become agitated and they just try to cross the road, and they may or may not cause an accident. And when they cause an accident, on average, that's thousands of dollars of damage to cars, and then of course in terms of hospitals, if a person became injured as a result of that collision. So wildlife vehicle collisions are something that we should think about, but of course, there are some studies that have documented that the vast majority of animals that are actually killed and therefore become roadkill, killed by vehicles, are the small little ones that we probably never even noticed. The little salamander that tried to cross the road in front of us, you never saw him and he got squished underneath your tires. Maybe a little turtle, or those are usually a little bit more noticeable. But very small mammals, very small reptiles, very small amphibians tend to be the large majority of roadkill. And that is really going to disrupt their life cycles. A lot of the amphibians, for instance, they are trying to live part of their life cycle in the upland, or if you're a reptile like a turtle, you're trying to lay your eggs up in the upland so that your eggs don't get waterlogged and the embryos therefore drown. So they need to go from the water to the upland and then back to the water. And with the way that we put in a lot of our roads, that means they have to cross that road twice. And that just opens them to the possibility of unfortunately being squished. So that further disrupts the gene flow that we're talking about. Gene flow is when a member of one population can go to another population and introduce more genetic diversity into that population by breeding with members of that population. That keeps any population very, very healthy. If that stops, then you have two problems. One, now you don't have new types of genes coming into a particular population, which means that if environmental conditions change, that population may not be able to adapt too well to those changing environmental conditions, making it more likely that that local population is going to go extinct. The other problem you have is that if the juveniles cannot disperse, well, then they have to stay in the same population that their parents were in, and now who do they mate with? It becomes more and more likely that they mate with a relative, someone that is rather closely genetically related to them, and that introduces what we call inbreeding depression. And in inbreeding depression, when you have close relatives mating with each other, certain genes become concentrated. Some of those genes are very negative. They can be genes that actually cause genetic diseases. And when that happens, now you have kind of this death spiral of that particular population. And again, you get a local extinction. How do we solve this? Well, one of the ways we can solve this is by actually creating corridors, habitat corridors between areas. So for instance, this little turtle here, if we had a little tunnel underneath, that's either a sidewalk or a road that that turtle was photographed on, all we needed is a little tunnel underneath there, and they can just walk right underneath and get to where they need to go. And that restores at least some of the connectivity on the landscape for both plants and animals. And we have to think about plants here, because if we boil animals down in general, what we can say is animals either eat plants directly, or they ate an animal that ate plants. So either way, plants are the basis for our ecosystems. And if we don't pay attention to whether or not plants are able to move about the landscape, then it doesn't matter whether the animals can move about the landscape, because there's ultimately not going to be food for them. Next slide, please. And now I'll leave it to Pam.
Thank you, David. So there are some things underway, some programs underway in Iowa that can help improve habitat. The first one I'll talk about is REAP. The second one we'll talk about is the 3/8 sales tax, also known as I Will. And the third one I'll talk about is the Wildlife Action Plan. So let's start out and talk about REAP. Now, the REAP program was passed in 1989, It's really called the Resource Enhancement and Protection Act. With that, there is an allocation of money, and that money is used for things like open spaces. It's used for a grant program for counties and cities for their conservation programs. The roadway account, the living roadway account, which helps beautify and restore habitat to road ditches. And there's also some money that can be used for wildlife. So 28% of the money is used for acquisition of open spaces. 20% is spent on county conservation boards through a grant process. And 3% is for this living roadway account. All of these funds and all this money could be used to enhance wildlife corridors so animals can cross roadways. And also to expand parks and recreation areas so that connectivity is provided. When the REAP law was originally passed, there was an appropriation level that was set, an authorization level at $30 million. Well, later on, that was changed to $20 million where it sits today. But even so, the legislature has not allocated the full 20 million. Lately, they've only been allocating 12 million to REAP. If we were to get a full 20 million, there is a lot of money that can be spent on wildlife habitat. REAP was recently extended to 2028, but we need to ensure that it extends beyond 2028 and is renewed by the legislature to go beyond that. We also need to work with our legislature to make sure that the open spaces account gets money. A lot of times the legislature has removed the money from the open spaces account and used it for something else. So REAP is a really great program to enhance wildlife habitat, and we just need to keep that program going. The next thing I'm going to talk about is I Will, the 3/8 sales tax. Now, we also call this the Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund. This was passed with significant voter approval. The only problem is the legislature has never allocated the 3/8. In other words, we haven't raised the sales tax. But there is a significant amount of money that would fund wildlife habitat, water quality, soils, preservation of soils, all kinds of conservation issues. Now, there's 23% of the money in that trust account that should go into natural resources. And that would be a valuable source of funds to enhance wildlife habitat. And again, I say the legislature has not passed this, and it's time to pass the I Will 3/8 sales tax. Now, the next thing I'd like to do is talk about the Wildlife Action Plan. It's a strategy that the Iowa Department of Natural Resources has put in place for conservation of all wildlife in the state. It's required by the federal government, and this year we should be seeing a new version of this. Now, it's required so that the state can get wildlife grants from the federal government. And the thing about the Wildlife Action Plan is that it is a blueprint for protecting and enhancing wildlife in Iowa. Now, the plan that we have today notes that Iowa has a lack of natural areas remaining, and therefore general strategies in the need to be set for prioritizing habitat protection, and they tend to focus on enlarging the size of habitat complexes, reducing fragmentation, and increasing connectivity between larger areas of habitat, all very necessary to keep wildlife healthy in the state. There are many species that have very specific habitat requirements, and some of those species require habitats that are rare in Iowa or particularly sensitive to human disturbance. So conservation of wildlife will require an approach that addresses both general as well as specific habitat needs. And this wildlife action plan is a really important document for the state. And like I say, it provides a roadmap. And with that, the next slide tells us what we can do in Iowa. So we have a strong base from which to build a vibrant conservation connectivity strategy. We do need some extra legislation that would direct the conservation agencies to collect data to identify essential wildlife corridors and the linkages that are needed. And then once you identify those corridors, you know where you can spend money for the best results. Another thing we need to do in Iowa is educate the public. It's been generations since Iowans have been able to experience our state and wildlife in a natural setting. You know, as David mentioned, we've lost a lot of our prairies, our wildlands, our woodlands, and our wetlands. Many Iowans don't feel a significant connection to the natural world, and many have no strong vision for restoring Iowa's natural heritage. So we need to work on educating the public so they care about these issues and are willing to support efforts to improve habitat. And there are economic challenges. You know, the path to protecting and restoring Iowa's natural environment is scientifically clear. We know we need to do it. But our current economic system prevents challenges to doing that restoration work. And that is the amount of ag land, the amount of effort that is spent on farming is really a kind of a barrier to restoring wildlife. And yet we know we can do that with stream buffers, with some edge of field restoration work, with restoring waterways, grass waterways, and putting prairie habitat into those grass waterways. We know we can start improving the wildlife habitat. On the next slide, it's a conclusion. Iowa doesn't have oceans and mountains, but we do have prairies, woods, lakes, and streams. And although we have lost significant wildlands, wild rivers, and streams and wildlife, some of the natural lands have been saved in parks and preserves. We also have some very nice areas in private ownership. Creating corridors so wildlife and native habitat can move and expand their territories will ensure their survival. And the benefits of wildlife corridors extend beyond wildlife protection and habitat preservation. People can benefit by having access to green space, by enjoying the beauty found outdoors, and by observing wildlife. Expanding wildlife habitat benefits us all. And with that, David and I will entertain questions.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. We do have one question here. You guys kind of laid out the, what legislature to look out for, but because so much of Iowa is private land, what are some strategies or programs or resources that private landowners can take to help make a corridor happen in their own backyard or their own acreage and stuff like that?
Pam, do you want to say anything first, or?
Go ahead.
Okay. The first thing I would say is that we need public-private partnerships. Roughly, 95, 96% of the land is in private ownership in Iowa. And we can actually create habitat corridors without taking any land away from anyone. But we need conservation reserve. We need conservation easements. If you're unfamiliar with what an easement is, you might be able to work with the Iowa Natural Heritage Land Trust. Iowa Natural Heritage will actually pay essentially to place an easement on your property, or American Farmland Trust. There are other organizations do this too. The Nature Conservancy does this all the time, where you actually get an income from preserving part of your land. Now, the easement then says that that land must be kept into whatever you preserved it as. So if you're going to restore prairie on your land, it's probably going to say it has to be prairie. there is some negotiation go on, and you can say, well, it can become a different type of natural land, but you can't turn it back into farmland. That easement attaches to your property, and so if you sell your property to someone else, that easement is part of it, and so they also cannot develop that part of your property. What we need then are the public-private partnerships so that we can work with farmers and other landowners and say, hey, you know what? Your neighbor is putting these 50 acres into this conservation easement. You have this area of your land that floods extensively whenever it rains. So you're probably not making much money off of that. Could we do a wetland reserve on that? Could we do, because their conservation reserve program is also a wetland reserve program, and that's right adjacent to the 50 acres that your neighbor did. Now we get neighbors linking up their land that way. One of the things that I'd like to see happen with the reserve programs, this is often federal money. Conservation reserve, I think, is for 10 years, and wetland reserve, if I remember right, is something similar to that. The problem is after 10 years, you're just starting to rebuild an ecosystem. So that's another type of legislation I'd like to see changed at the federal level to really help landowners so they could opt into, say, permanent conservation reserve program. And again, then the landowner gets an income off of that land. That's something we have to keep in mind when we're working with farmers, when we're working with ranchers and others that own working land. The reason that the land must be working is because that's how they make an income. Otherwise, they can't live. So we can't take away their ability to provide for themselves and their families. But what we can do is make conservation pay, and conservation can pay through these programs.
Man, I love it. Thank you so much for laying that out for us. And thank you so much for both of your insights. And we'll get this posted to our YouTube, and the full report will be in the comments too, so everybody can check that out. But thank you so much again for joining our Lunch and Learn this Friday. We'll be back next Friday, hopefully talking about some black bears. We'll see. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.